Hello, BookTube. Welcome to another Middlemarch meditation. We're going to begin chapter 12 today. My background photograph is a fireplace, one of the larger fireplaces within Linlithgow Castle. I said that we were in Scotland first week of November, and we went to Linlithgow Castle, which is where Mary, Queen of Scots, grew up. It's weird visiting a castle shell where the only thing that still remains is the stonework. It's really difficult, I find, to imagine, even though they did do visual reconstructions in pictures for us to see what it would have looked like with hangings and furniture and people milling around. But it's weird to stand in those cold, deserted places and really with no roof and to imagine that it was ever a really beautiful interior. But the funny thing is, the location we're going to be at in chapter 12, which is Stone Court, even with furniture and living human beings and a roof, I still got the impression of a place that was cold, a place that was not warm and not welcoming, particularly the fireplace. I kept feeling as I was reading the text that even though we were close to a fireplace in the scene, it just felt like the room would have been cold. I don't know why. Another bit of trivia, by the way, Coventry in the West Midlands, which is close to where George Eliot grew up. There is a Middlemarch business park, and one of the main office buildings there has been called Stone Court. It looks a lot warmer. But that's a digression, and we really need to get on today. So, chapter 12 begins with Eliot's usual epigraphs. This one is from Chaucer, from the Canterbury Tales, specifically from the Miller's Tale, and specifically from lines 3774 to 3775. That's a standard numbering system for the text. I will leave a link. There's a fantastic website where you can read both the Old English side by side with a more modern English translation of the tales. And that's where I'm going to have to leave it, because to make this Middlemarch meditation more meaningful, yes, we do need to look at Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and the Miller's Tale, the story in particular, but also we've got to look at medieval fabric manufacturing. My goodness, going to have a day today with pronunciation. In England, that time, and even up until mechanical spinning could happen in the early 19th century, most garments were made of wool, and that yarn that made the cloth was spun by hand using two tools, a spool and a distaff. So here is an 1873 oil painting by William Adolphe Bouguereau. I think I've got the pronunciation right. I don't normally struggle with French, but it was a strange surname. I'd never seen quite that many vowels before. Anyway, it depicts a young girl holding a spindle, and that's the piece that is dangling there from her right hand. Right, that's the spindle, and the distaff is tucked into her left arm there, as you can see. Now, the distaff always held a good supply of cleaned, combed fleece from the sheep. The spinner would then use her fingers, usually, her fingers, to tease out and give the first twists to that strand of fleece from the distaff. And they were, at the same time, they were letting the weight of the spindle pull that strand, and also the twisting motion on the spinner's fingers would make the spindle spin, and that would tighten and strengthen the yarn. In my description box, you're going to find a YouTube link to a short video that just reenacts the process so that you can see it, and it's good fun to watch. And if you are female, the film will leave you with a strong impression that what you would have spent most of your free time doing if you'd been alive in Northern Europe during the Middle Ages, well, it would have been this, right? You would have spent just hours and hours of time making woolen yarn. So now we know what the epigraph means by distaff. Distaff is the tool that holds your supply of fleece to make yarn. Now, the word tow refers to the combed fleece that was on the distaff ready for spinning. So your tow was all that fluffy stuff that was sitting on the distaff. The Middle English word was town, which came from the Old English Togen, which is close to the Middle German zogen, which has become the modern German ziehen, and that is the verb to pull or to tug. So there we go. So your toe was the supply you were going to tug or pull off of. So if we repeat the phrase, he had more tow on his distaff than Gervase knew, we get the suggestion that the true extent of the matter being discussed in that quote is something's being concealed. Not everything is being revealed and upfront. And so now it might help to say something about Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and in particular the Miller's Tale. What I'm not going to do is tell you the whole story of the Miller's Tale, and that's because it's quite intricate, but also it's rude. There's no apologizing for it. I remember reading Chaucer's Canterbury Tales for the first time in high school, and I was shocked. Perhaps I had in England, I think there's been so much influence from Victorian culture and also 17th century Puritan culture that it's really difficult, I think, for English-speaking people to believe that there was ever a time that English-speaking people really didn't mind talking more openly about matters intimate and sexual. But there was, and it was Chaucer's time, and it was yeah. So I don't read it out loud because I think it would surprise anybody who wasn't already familiar with the Middle Ages. The miller who tells the story, he's drunk at the time, so you can imagine he's got no inhibitions either. So that it's just a big setup for a very, very rude story. But we're going to concentrate on the character named Gervase in this epigraph. Gervase is a blacksmith, and he is at work at the time this quote appears. He's heating up the working end of a metal plowshare. And a plowshare is shaped, it's a bit like a garden trowel, but imagine that much, much bigger, okay? And while he's working, he's visited by a young man named Absalom. And Absalom asks him, please, can I borrow that plowshare while the metal is still red hot? Now, naturally, Gervase can't help but ask Absalom why he would want to borrow such a thing, but Absalom is not ready to share everything that's on his mind. He's got a plan, he's not about to share it, and that's because he's about to do something not very nice. All right, I'll leave you to read the story if you want to. So, the epigraph is referring to the fact that the situation where someone does not reveal everything they are thinking or everything they have planned, and in Absalom's case, that's because he's thinking of doing somebody harm. I won't say what, as you know, I will say that once you know the Miller's Tale, once you've read it, unfortunately, you can never get those images out of your mind. So bear that in mind before you decide to go and read it. But that's what we're talking about. We're talking about somebody having more in their brain than they are willing to tell people generally. They have a plan, but they're not making it public. Now, with that theme in mind, we'll go on and look at the first pages of this chapter. Okay, we've got book. Here we go, starting chapter 12. The ride to Stone Court, which Fred and Rosamond took the next morning, lay through a pretty bit of midland landscape, almost all meadows and pastures, with hedgerows still allowed to grow in bushy beauty and to spread out coral fruit for the birds. I think it's important to stop a moment and note that this is a midland landscape, and that needs to be explained for anybody who's not living in England and hasn't traveled around. I am going to put up a partial map. This is just England. You can see a bit of Scotland and Northern Ireland, but that's not what we're looking at today. So we're interested in these coloured regions, and they're sections of England made up of several counties, but generally referred to, and we still use these references today, particularly if you're listening to a weather forecast, for example, we'll often refer to these areas of England. There are two regions called the Midlands. There is The East Midlands you see there in blue, that's where I live. The Midlands that Eliot's narrator is describing, I'm pretty certain, is the West Midlands, because that's where Eliot grew up, the yellow section there. And the narrator is channeling some of Eliot's affection for that area. If I were going to contrast the East Midlands to the West Midlands, I'd say the East Midlands is, in general, flatter. Not flat altogether, but flatter, drier. The West Midlands has a lot more hills. It's beginning to rise up into Wales, and it's much greener because it tends to get rain that tends to come through from the west, through Wales, and into the West Midlands first. The West Midlands would be slightly wetter than the East Midlands. I mean, all of England is wet, but there are places more wet than other places, if you get me. Now, this coral fruit, I finished the sentence, didn't I, talking about the coral fruit for the birds. That could be a number of different things. We know from the timing, we've been told that the narrator has moved us back several weeks into the past, so we're still in autumn. We're probably late September, early October. The coral fruit mentioned by the narrator could be one of two things. It could be rose hips, or it could be bullaces. Bullaces are a variety of wild plum, where the fruits are very small. They actually look more like blueberries for North American viewers, like a blueberry, and the fruit can be blue or purple or apricot colored. Bullaces are edible, and foragers will go searching for them about the same time in England that you would go looking to pick blackberries. Reading on. Little details gave each field a particular physiognomy, dear to the eyes that have looked on them from childhood. The pool in the corner where the grasses were dank and trees leaned whisperingly, the great oak shadowing a bare place in mid-pasture, the high bank where the ash trees grew, the sudden slope of the old marl pit making a red background for the burdock, the huddled roofs and ricks of the homestead without a traceable way of approach, the grey gate and fences against the depths of the bordering wood, and the stray hovel, its old thatch full of mossy hills and valleys with wondrous modulations of light and shadow, such as we travel far to see in later life, and see larger, but not more beautiful. These are the things that make the gamut of joy in landscape to Midland-bred souls, the things they toddled among, or perhaps learned by heart, standing between their father's knees while he drove leisurely. You could see the narrator's affection, and I think Eliot's affection, for that landscape of her childhood. And of course, it's full of details that we need to go through, just so you can understand what is she looking at and what's exciting her so much. Let's talk about three different things. She mentions the old marl pit, making a red background for the burdock. In fact, I just realized that I blocked the text out. So you poor guys, you can't even read along. Let's get this right, get the map away and leave you with the text. So we talk about here the old marl pit making a red background for the burdock. Marl was the term for seams of soft mineral, and they were found in the soil all over England. The high carbonate content made it useful as a fertilizer, and so it was used up until, say, the mid-19th century. Usually each farmer dug his own marl pit on his land in order to extract the marl. There we go. I filled the screen. I thought you deserved a good look at it. This is an example of a disused marl pit, but now you can see the red earth that it exposes. But this would have been dug on a farmer's land in order to extract the marl for fertilizer. The passage also mentioned burdock, the old marl pit making a red background for the burdock. So the red background, what's the contrast? Well, it's this low-growing plant, Arcticum lapa, a wild plant with large trowel-shaped leaves and producing seeds in spiny pods. The roots can be eaten or they can be made into tea, and they're supposed to be helpful to digestion and have anti-inflammatory properties. Let's go on. There's one more thing I want to show you, which is about the roofs and the ricks. Ricks refer to corn ricks. So when grain was harvested, there was a technique for gathering it together and piling it up. I guess you'd call it a haystack, but it obviously took more skill than a haystack, because it was a haystack that had its own thatched roof to protect most of the hay from wet weather. And so these are, you can see a photographic example here of two corn ricks side by side. And then, of course, the etching, the engraving is showing a man preparing the thatched roof. So these were quite intricate constructions. I haven't seen these myself in modern day England. I'm not sure when they ceased to be a feature of the agricultural landscape. Maybe somebody who had a childhood here in England in, I don't know, shortly after the war, shortly after the Second World War, could they tell me when did corn ricks disappear? Do they remember corn ricks when they were children? That'd be interesting to know, actually, because I didn't get time to look up when did these cease to be a feature. I've never seen them except in old photographs. But the road, even the by road, was excellent, for Lowick, as we have seen, was not a parish of muddy lanes and poor tenants, and it was into Lowick parish that Fred and Rosamond entered after a couple of miles riding. Another mile would bring them to Stone Court, and at the end of the first half the house was already visible, looking as if it had been arrested in its growth toward a stone mansion by an unexpected budding of farm buildings on its left flank, which had hindered it from becoming anything more than the substantial dwelling of a gentleman farmer. It was not the less agreeable an object in the distance, for the cluster of pinnacled corn ricks which balanced the fine row of walnuts on the right. A couple of things that we'll do. Again, more terms to look at, aren't we? What is a byroad? It says, but the road, even the byroad. Okay, what is a byroad? A byroad still exists in England today. It is not a paved road, although it may have remnants of paving on it. It's a very difficult one today. But at the time Eliot was writing, it would not have been paved. It would be wide enough for one vehicle, but vehicles were not intended to use it that often. It was mainly for access between a property and a real road, if you understand me. Byroads are meant for horse riders, cyclists, and walkers. They do not appear on an ordinary road atlas, and they won't appear on satellite navigation either. Byroads are mapped today by the Ordnance Survey, along with public footpaths, and footpaths are narrower than byroads. They're too narrow for a vehicle. There's more to go into, but I'm not going to go into that. But that's what a byroad is. So it would be a perfect out-of-the-way place for riding a horse. Of course, in the early 19th century, there would only have been horse transport, but you would avoid a carriage or a buggy by using a byroad, because a byroad probably wouldn't be nice enough for a buggy. It'd probably be a little bit uneven surface, and so better not to take it down a byroad. Now, what is a parish? That's the other thing, because it mentions that we're now in the parish of Lowick. In the UK, the smallest division of local government is a parish, and it really only applies now in rural areas. In Eliot's day, it would have been an administrative district that came under one particular church, and that church would have certain responsibilities to the inhabitants, to marry and bury and christen, etc., and to keep records of all those events, and also to collect tithes from the area and to give relief to the poor. We noted that this is Lowick, so it's Mr. Casaubon's parish, with a reputation for good housekeeping that we all have already heard about when Dorothea and Celia and Mr. Brooke visited Mr. Casaubon's house. Arrested in its growth. I think this is interesting. Let's talk about Stone Court itself. The first glimpse they get of Stone Court, the first thing the narrator said is it looks like a mansion that has been arrested in its growth. And interesting, it's a comfortable house, that much is clear, but it almost seems as though it's not large for the sake of looking impressive. And that is conveying a message to me about its present owner. And perhaps Mr. Featherstone is a man who does not spend money just to show that he has money, if that makes sense. He doesn't look to purchase things that make impressive appearances. The farm buildings suggest that where he spends money is where it's likely to make more money. The buildings will either be for animals or storage of tools or equipment, harvested crops, that kind of thing. And I think we should talk about these walnut trees as well. We remember on Mr. Casaubon's property that he had yew trees and other decorative types of trees, lime trees. Walnut trees, an interesting choice. And again, we need a photograph, don't we? So just bear with. I'm going to find, I had a photograph of a walnut tree. There we go. So it's a very impressive tree of and by itself. Would make a brilliant shade tree, would kind of rival an oak tree for the impression that it can make when it's mature. But a walnut tree, very significant, the number of uses for the tree and its fruit. So let's talk about this. Walnuts, of course, themselves were a saleable commodity for food, but let's talk about the walnut shells. The walnut shells could be ground up and used for water filtration, or if they were finely ground enough, they made an effective abrasive for industrial blasting, to clean out engines. Walnut husks have been used to make writing ink since Leonardo da Vinci's time, and walnut wood in the 19th century, walnut wood was highly prized for making furniture and other decorative wooden objects, boxes, etc. So I like what the narrator is doing here. Our very first glimpse of the house, what are we? Well, we're actually learning more about the owner of the house. We know something significant about Mr. Featherstone even before we meet him. I would be very surprised if he didn't turn out to be an extremely prudent, shrewd, and very forward-looking where money matters are concerned. So now we go to the top of page 105, where the text says, "Presently, it was possible to discern something that might be a gig on the circular drive before the front door." "Dear me," said Rosamond, "I hope none of my uncle's horrible relations are there." "They are, though. That is Mrs. Wall's gig, the last yellow gig left, I should think. When I see Mrs. Wall in it, I understand how yellow can have been worn for mourning. That gig seems to me more funereal than a hearse. But then Mrs. Wall always has black crape on. How does she manage it, Rosie? Her friends can't always be dying." "I don't know at all, and she is not in the least evangelical," said Rosamond, reflectively, as if that religious point of view would have fully accounted for perpetual crape. "And not poor," she added, after a moment's pause. "No, by George, they are as rich as Jews, those Walls and Featherstones, I mean, for people like them who don't want to spend anything. And yet they hang about my uncle like vultures, and are afraid of a farthing going away from their side of the family. But I believe he hates them all." Okay, so interesting passage here. Little example of English anti-Semitism. Nothing new there. Let's talk about the colours. The yellow gig that Mrs. Wall has, even though she always dresses in black. I thought that was, the combination didn't make me think of a funeral, but it did make me think of a danger warning. Wasps and hornets, they are bright yellow with black. I don't know why Fred Vinci refers to it as the last yellow gig left. Google wasn't helpful. I tried to look this up, tried to see was it a fashionable colour for a particular period of time. But that's because Google isn't helpful because the word gig has changed meaning, hasn't it? So I had to wade through a lot of websites relating to music or comedy performances. And I can only assume that there must have been a fashion in maybe the late 18th century for yellow gigs, which has now declined. But Mrs. Wall is still driving around in this vehicle that has lost its value because it's gone out of fashion. Black crepe. Now, black crepe, which Mrs. Wall seems to like to wear, was a fabric much used for mourning costumes. There was a generally accepted period of time during which mourning costume had to be worn in England. But in spite what Fred and Rosamond think, it wasn't unusual for an older woman who had reached a particular time of life, the point where she probably has lost a husband, probably has lost her parents, very certainly has lost at least one child. That was a high chance. It's very likely that she would choose to wear black to reflect all those accumulated losses. The narrative shifts all of a sudden, and we're not with Fred and Rosamond anymore. We've shifted. We're now right inside Stone Court with whoever we find there. And of course, it starts with Mrs. Whale. We're about to meet her. The Mrs. Whale, who was so far from being admirable in the eyes of these distant connections, had happened to say this very morning, not at all with a defiant air, but in a low, muffled, neutral tone, as of a voice heard through cotton wool, that she did not wish to enjoy their good opinion. She was seated, as she observed, on her own brother's hearth, and had been Jane Featherstone 25 years before she had been Jane Wall, which entitled her to speak when her own brother's name had been made free with by those who had no right to it. Okay, whoa. So we've jumped right into a very interesting character analysis. So this is Mr. Featherstone's widowed sister. And there's so much in the paragraph here. First of all, her voice. I think that's interesting that she has chosen to speak the way she did. She'd been saying her thoughts out loud, but not loud enough. And she's been doing this to her brother, Mr. Featherstone. We'll see that as we move on in the text. But for right now, let's just concentrate on this. It's just my opinion, but I believe she chose her volume very deliberately. And why? Because if you say something just loud enough for people to tell that you're speaking, but not loud enough for it to be clear what you are saying, you force other people, out of politeness, to ask you to repeat yourself. And this is a passive-aggressive tactic, because once people have asked you to repeat yourself, then it cannot be said that the information they hear from you is something they haven't asked for. Her first remark, the one made in a low, mumbling voice, no one asked for. It was her opinion. She wanted to voice it. But by voicing it in such a way that it couldn't quite be heard, she's obligated whoever's in the room with her to ask her to repeat herself. And then when she repeats herself, of course, all she's doing, she could argue, all she's doing is responding to this request that she repeat herself. It's just interesting. Make a note of it, because she isn't the only one who has behavioral quirks. And she's, of course, the final sentence of the paragraph is also emphasizing what she feels her position is, her right to speak. So even though she has done this passive-aggressive technique, where she's spoken and yet not spoken clearly enough to be understood, nevertheless she feels she has a right to speak. And she talks to you. Why? Why? Because she is the sister. So she has the same mother and father as the man that she's talking to. And so she believes she is therefore more entitled to speak when she says her own brother's name had been made free with. What being made free with? Someone has used that name as backing authority in a way that they shouldn't, in her mind. What are you driving at there? Said Mr. Featherstone, holding his stick between his knees and settling his wig, so he's definitely an 18th century man, he's still got a wig, while he gave her a momentary sharp glance, which seemed to react on him like a draught of cold air and set him coughing. Mrs. Wall had to defer her answer until he was quiet again, till Mary Garth had supplied him with fresh syrup, and he had begun to rub the gold knob of his stick, looking bitterly at the fire. It was a bright fire, but it made no difference to the chill-looking purplish tint of Mrs. Wall's face, which was as neutral as her voice, having mere chinks for eyes and lips that hardly moved when speaking. Brilliant characterization here. I think she's doing a little bit of what Dickens might do. Dickens was a master of this, wasn't he? Of creating a sense of immediately of face or physiognomy, and she's done that here. So Mrs. Wall has a face with really tiny, narrow eyes and a little mouth, but she doesn't move very much when she talks. And there's no way to imagine a little tight, closed-up face like that without thinking that the person that owns that face is probably not the most pleasant company. Mr. Featherstone seems to think so too. He also has a passive-aggressive technique. His sister has made a remark that he can't quite understand. He knows what she's doing. He knows she wants to say something, but she wants me to ask her to say it. So he asks her, "What are you driving at there?" But then, of course, he proceeds to have a coughing fit. Now, that could be something he cannot control. He does seem to have an illness which gives him a cough. We know that from previous chapters. However, the effect of this great long coughing fit is that Mrs. Wall has to wait before she can say the thing that she desperately wants to say. She has to wait until all the folderol happens, that Mr. Featherstone gets his syrup from Mary Garth and he settles down a little bit and he's quiet again. Sorry, everyone, I had to do a little edit there for a cough. It's doing really well with this recording, and the cough is much better, thank you, but it's still there. There's one more thing I want to mention about the section I've just read, and that is the gold knob on Mr. Featherstone's walking stick. She makes a point to note how he rubs it as he stares bitterly into the fire. And to me, it's just a subtle reminder that gold imagery is that this is the man with the money, Mr. Featherstone. And so anybody who wants some of that money must defer to him, must wait on him, hoping, but also that he rubs it bitterly suggests that having that money it's not given him much happiness, quite the opposite, that he looks bitterly into the fire as he rubs the knob on that stick. Page 106, and we start with Mrs. Wall finally getting her chance to speak her mind. She says, "The doctors can't master that cough, brother. It's just like what I have, for I'm your own sister, constitution and everything. But as I was saying, it's a pity Mrs. Vincey's family can't be better conducted." Cha! You said nothing of the sort. You said somebody had made free with my name. Now that's interesting. So what Mr. Featherstone is revealing is that he did, in fact, understand exactly what she said. So now we know there is a communication game going on here between these two. That what we were reading on page 105, where Mrs. Wall appears to say something but not be understood and is asked to repeat herself, and then there's the coughing fit, all that was a performance, maybe a performance that has happened many, many times. And no more than can be proved, she says. If what everybody says is true, my brother Solomon tells me it's the talk up and down in Middlemarch, how unsteady young Vincey is, and has been, forever gambling at billiards since home he came. Nonsense! What's a game at billiards? It's a good, gentlemanly game, and young Vincey is not a clodhopper. If your son John took to billiards now, he'd make a fool of himself. Interesting what's going on here. So he's making a constant comparison between her son, John. She's obviously making a poke at Fred Vincey, and Mr. Featherstone immediately defends Fred, but likes to make a mention of her son, John, by contrast, sort of saying, well, yeah, Fred, whatever Fred can do, John can't. John's not up to it. I'm going to just move the text up a bit and we will carry on reading. There we go. Your nephew John never took to billiards or any other game, brother, and is far from losing hundreds of pounds, which, if everybody says is true, must be found somewhere else than out of Mr. Vincey the father's pocket. For they say he's been losing money for years, though nobody would think so to see him go coursing and keeping open house as they do. And I've heard say Mr. Bulstrode condemns Mrs. Vincey beyond anything for her flightiness and spoiling her children so. What's Bulstrode to me? I don't bank with him. Well, Mrs. Bulstrode is Mr. Vincey's own sister, and they do say that Mr. Vincey mostly trades on the bank money, and you may see yourself, brother, when a woman past 40 has pink strings always flying, and that light way of laughing at everything, it's very unbecoming. But indulging your children is one thing, and finding money to pay their debts is another. And it's openly said that young Vincey has raised money on his expectations. I don't say what expectations. Miss Garth hears me, and is welcome to tell again. I know young people hang together. No, thank you, Mrs. Wall, said Mary Garth. I dislike hearing scandal too much to wish to repeat it. We'll stop now, that being at the end of the section. I realize I didn't quite pull the page up quite enough. There's Mary replying to Mrs. Wall. So many things going on here. Okay, let's just make a few points about this passage. Mr. Featherstone, we know, is being just as passive-aggressive as his sister. He just has a different technique. He pretends not to hear her, but in fact, he has. Now, every point his sister makes in this little conversation, he has a counterpoint to. And because he's so good at countering every point, I suspect that something like this conversation has taken place on more than one occasion in the past, a conversation where Mrs. Wall tries, but she doesn't succeed, in making her son John look superior and the better person to be trusted with the Featherstone money than Fred Vincy. Okay, so it suggests that she has the idea that Fred is going to get a substantial amount of that money, more than she thinks is right, and we shall see. And also Mary Garth, who has remained silent up till now, she refuses to be part of this game. She refuses to be nominated by Mrs. Whale as a supporter for this cause. She refuses on grounds of morality, of shunning scandal, which is a very good behavior for a 19th century upper-class young woman. You should do that. So she's doing what she should. Mr. Featherstone rubbed the knob of his stick. There he goes again, fixated with that gold piece on the top of his walking stick, and made a brief, convulsive show of laughter, which had much the same genuineness as an old whist player's chuckle over a bad hand. Now that's telling. We know what whist is. A whist is a card game, and in all card games, or in most card games, bluffing is really important. So it's interesting that he plays a bluff here. Mr. Featherstone rubbed the knob of his stick, and he made a brief, convulsive show of laughter. And it's suggesting it's not genuine laughter. It's like the kind that a card player laughs when he's got a bad hand. In other words, the laugh is to make people believe that he's got a better hand than he actually has. And he ends the page by saying to Mrs. Wall, "And who pretends to say Fred Vincy hasn't got expectations? Such a fine, spirited fellow is like enough to have 'em." And now we'll quickly switch over to the next page. Ta-da! The power of editing. It's wonderful. It's like a magic. Here we are on page 107, and we're at the top. And Mrs. Wall, it says, there was a slight pause before Mrs. Wall replied. Why? Well, with the same genuineness, really, as Mr. Featherstone's laughter. That was ungenuine. That was put on. That was a performance. And it says, when she did so, that is, when she finally did reply after her pause, her voice seemed to be slightly moistened with tears, though her face was still dry. So, there we go. They're both practicing their strange bluffing faces on each other. This is a bluffing face on Mrs. Wall's part, that she's broken-hearted. And she says, "Whether or no, brother, it is naturally painful to me and my brother Solomon to hear your name made free with, and your complaint being such as may carry you off sudden." In other words, you're very ill and you could die any second. Okay. "And people who are no more Featherstones than the Merry Andrew at the fair, openly reckoning on your property coming to them. And me your own sister, and Solomon your own brother. And if that's to be it, what has it pleased the Almighty to make families for?" Here Mrs. Wall's tears fell, but with moderation. Okay? Not really the passion in there. But she's making a point. She's making a point that Fred Vincy isn't a Featherstone. He's not a Featherstone. He's related by marriage only. He's not as close to you as Solomon and myself, who are your siblings. "Come out of it, Jane," said Mr. Featherstone, looking at her. "You mean to say Fred Vincy has been getting somebody to advance him money on what he says he knows about my will, eh?" "I never said so, brother." "Oh, no, well, not in so many words, and yet." Mrs. Wall's voice had again, note, become dry and unshaken. So, oh my goodness, these two playing their little game. "It was told me by my brother Solomon last night, when he called, coming from market to give me advice about the old wheat, me being a widow, and my son John only 23, though steady beyond anything. And he had it from the most undeniable authority, and not one, but many." Mr. Featherstone says, "Stuff and nonsense. I don't believe a word of it. It's all got-up story. Go to the window, Missy." He's speaking to Mary now. "Go to the window, Missy. I thought I heard a horse. See if it's the doctor coming." "Not got up by me, brother," Mrs. Whale goes on, regardless. "Not this story isn't got up by me, my brother, nor yet by Solomon, who, whatever else he may be, and I don't deny he has oddities, has made his will and parted his property equal between such kin as he's friends with. Though for my part, I think there are times when some should be considered more than others. But Solomon makes it no secret what he means to do." Oh my goodness. And I'm not moving the text on. I'm being very bad here. I'm reading off the book, and I should really be giving you, there we go, move it up, so you can follow the speech. But you can see that I've underlined really heavily her last statement there. But Solomon makes it no secret what he means to do. This is the whole point of this bizarre performance conversation. It is yet another attempt by Mrs. Wall, and heaven only knows how many attempts she has made, to get her brother Peter Featherstone to come out and say definitively who is in his will, who benefits in his will, and how much. And all these little niggly conversations, these little pretend conversations, and possibly even invented rumors. It's difficult to know whether they are invented or not. I guess we're going to find out. All of this is so that she can get an absolute idea of how her children stand money-wise, because that's what's important. And Mr. Featherstone, how does he reply? Oh, I love his reply. "The more fool he," said Mr. Featherstone, with some difficulty, breaking into a severe fit of coughing, another one of those severe fits of coughing, that required Mary Garth to stand near him, so that she did not find out whose horses they were, which presently paused, stamping on the gravel before the door. There's just a wow. This is such what you've learned in such a short passage of time. And this is, to my mind, it shows a talent in the writing, because you've achieved so much in just one little conversation. You realize that the relationship between Mr. Featherstone and all his relations, it's not an easy one. And he has taken a choice to withhold information from them. Now that's interesting. Why would he do that? He is clearly not well. And if what his sister says is true, that he probably hasn't got long to live because of this consumption, and people didn't live long. We've already talked about Mr. Casaubon being in his 40s and being considered a very old man. I don't know how old Mr. Featherstone is, but being that he's not well, yeah, he might die sooner. Naturally, everybody wants to know, where is all your money going? Very interesting. So we're just at the point here, and we're going to leave off now, because Rosamond and Fred are about to arrive at Stone Court, and that's where we're going to pick up next time. Now, speaking of next time, I am going to make good on my promise to start producing 2 Middlemarch meditation videos per month. And so we're going to get 2 in November. That means you're going to get 1 in a week's time. I'm going to make these on and post them on Sundays, because they do take more editing than my other kinds of videos. So I need a little bit more time to do all that editing. And since we've only got 2 Sundays left in November, then you can see what's happening here. You're getting 1 today. If you tune in next Sunday, you should find a second one. Okay? So you can mark up your calendars. Maybe that's what we'll do. Maybe we'll designate the 3rd and 4th Sundays of each month as Middlemarch meditation. And that's kind of cool, because what it's doing, giving me time behind the scenes to read other books for reviewing, maybe longer books that, I need a bit more time. So thank you very much for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing everybody next weekend. Take care. Bye-bye.